Hello and welcome to 168 Hours Studio. My name is Suren Sargsyan. I'm the director of the Armenian Center for American Studies. My colleague is Mr. Artur Khachikian, professor from Stanford University, and our distinguished guest today, Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, who was invited to Yerevan by us to talk to us and to present his views about the future of the world. Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to Armenia.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much for giving us a little bit more of your time.
It's a
promise
pleasure.
this is not going to take much more than this. So this morning we received some pretty alarming news. Apparently the U.S. administration has given its okay to launch missile strikes deep into Russian territory, and England and France followed suit. We were all hoping for the era of peace. You know, President Trump said that once I come to power, I will end this war in 24 hours. But now it seems like events have taken a sudden turn for the worse. What consequences do you think this might have? I mean, probably not exactly the result we were hoping for.
Well, the Biden administration is in its last weeks. I don't think that the decision today, reckless as it is in my view, will change anything about the incoming Trump administration plans. This idea of striking deep inside Russia is an idea that Biden rejected just a few weeks ago. He rejected it on the advice of the Pentagon, which said it is dangerous, it is provocative, and it won't change the course of the war. Nothing from then till now has changed. Biden, however, is an old man. He's not very alert. There are people around him who are extreme hardliners. I don't really know whether he personally made this decision or whether it's Sullivan or Blinken or people whose names we don't even know in the deep state. But whatever the reason, this is a terrible decision because it just brings us a step closer to nuclear war, which we don't want to be anywhere close to. It won't change the outcome of the Ukraine war. It was rejected just a couple of weeks ago. And an administration that has been voted out of office should not do such provocative things. Again, we know that our president is doddering. He's an old man. He's not alert. And the administration and the people around him should not be taking these irresponsible actions. My own view, my own hope, is that whatever happens between now and January 20th, and I hope not much, that President Putin takes a deep breath, President Trump takes a deep breath, and that the day that Trump is in power, then they really have that phone call to say, let's stop this war. The United States has to say one magic sentence: NATO will not expand to Ukraine. On that basis, President Putin will say, we will stop fighting. The rest is details. And that's what I count on happening when Trump is in office. At least I hope so. One's never sure about these matters. But Biden has been one of the worst presidents we've had. This last decision is consistent with his being a terrible president, inconsequent, constantly changing positions, not even necessarily in control. And I'm hoping that Trump will change this.
The second question actually is about something you already said during your first meeting in Yerevan with students and some academic circles. You said that the neighbors should talk to each other. They should negotiate, reconcile, etc. So, but in this case, we have a problem if we discuss the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They simply don't want to recognize Armenia as a state because they're saying, you know, you still have something to return to us. You have to return to us Lake Sevan, like Suren, etc. So what do you think about it? Is it possible to talk to a neighbor that is not willing to talk to you?
Well, first of all, I think it's possible for two sides that don't agree with each other to sit down and talk. Talk is talk. You may reach an agreement or not reach an agreement, but better to talk and hear the positions of the two sides. But countries never merely have bilateral relations. This is a region of many countries and many interests. It's a region, of course, I don't need to repeat it, of Turkey, Iran, Russia, that have major interests as major powers. It's a region of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia that are in between these big countries. It's not a bilateral issue only between Armenia and Azerbaijan. What about the other regional powers. Well, they would like to see quiet, for example. So maybe they would say to their Azerbaijan colleagues, reach an agreement. We'd rather have quiet here than war. One thing I can say as an economist, war is incredibly destructive of everybody's interests except for a very few war profiteers. Everyone else loses. They lose their lives, they lose their homes, they lose their livelihoods, they lose their incomes. War is the #1 disaster. For me as an economist, all I think about is how to build, how to invest. War destroys all of that in an hour. So I want countries to sit down and resolve their problems peacefully. I want them to understand that these bilateral tensions and frictions are not theirs alone in a closed universe, but in a broader world where the interests of peace are very substantial. And maybe the fact that there are 3 major regional powers, Russia, Turkey, Iran, none of which wants to see one of the others somehow gain a huge advantage, makes it possible for everybody to say, let's calm down, let's create conditions for peace, let's create that idea, which I like, corridors, east-west, north-south. They happen to pass through Armenia. Do it in a way which is good for Armenia, for its tourism, for its culture, for its role in the world, of course, but do it in a basis of peace. And that, to my mind, is always possible if people come and think seriously, is the alternative conflict really good for us? The answer is always no. Now, of course, I've tried to say this in many places. I told the Ukrainians this for years. Don't get caught up in American propaganda. American propaganda is, we've got your back. And I say, yes, but who has your front? They will shoot you from the front. It turns out 600,000 Ukrainians are dead already because the United States stupidly said to the Ukrainians, it's okay, you're protected, you're one of us. You'll be part of NATO. Even though the Russians said, no, that won't happen. And the Ukrainians didn't listen. They thought I wasn't telling them the truth. Unfortunately, I was telling them the grim reality, maybe from their situation, which is don't listen to empty promises from 10,000 miles away. Try to pay attention in your own neighborhood. If you have a powerful neighbor, don't humiliate it, don't insult it, don't say, I'm not going to deal with you, especially even a country the size of Ukraine can't do that, but a smaller country, be careful, just be careful. No one's got your back or your front other than yourselves, but you are in a neighborhood where there's a common interest for peace. Try to make that puzzle piece work so that everybody comes out for peace.
With reference to that, if I may, Professor Sachs, in a conversation yesterday, we were talking about a possible stabilizing influence of some kind of an international mediator or some kind of a hegemon, not necessarily a great power, but perhaps an organization of countries that could play a stabilizing role in fostering this kind of an environment for peace and trade. And we mentioned BRICS. Do you think that perhaps it's worthwhile to look into the countries, let's say, of the Middle East, Persian Gulf, India, BRICS, China? I mean, will they have any interest in having a stable economic environment here so that all these corridors could function, east, west, and north, south?
First, my view of the BRICS is that it is an important grouping. When the BRICS countries plus their aspirant members and friends met in Kazan, Russia a couple of weeks ago, there were 36 countries around the table. When I added up their populations, it turned out to be 57% of the world population, so it's no small group. Of course it has China, it has India, of course it has Brazil, Russia, South Africa is the beginning 5, but Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, United Arab Emirates as the next 4, and then dozens more that say we want in as well. So first, it's an important group. Second, it's got 2 unifying themes. One is we want economic development because this is a group of emerging economies by and large. It's not the richest countries in the world, but it is the fastest growing countries in the world. So that's exciting. And China is the biggest market in the world. So this is a very important economic group. The second unifying theme of the BRICS is we don't want to be pushed around by one power. We don't want the United States saying, we determine the rules-based order. No, they said, come on, we want to live under the UN Charter. We want to live in a multipolar world, which I very much believe in. Yes, there are powers. There are some big powers like the US, like Europe, like Russia, like China, like India, but respect each other. Don't say one of them is going to dominate. If one of them tries to dominate, the others will unite in opposition, and moreover, you end up in war. So major powers should learn to get along with each other, not to confront each other. This again is the United States' big mistake. It says, we go where we want. We don't care what Russia says. We go where we want. We don't care what China says. Well, you do that long enough, you end up with wars like the war in Ukraine. So could the BRICS be helpful? Of course it could. First of all, two of the major BRICS countries are Russia and Iran. And Armenia is right in the middle of that. And Russia and Iran want more trade. And Armenia is right in the middle of that. Being an entrepot, being a center between trading regions is a good business, by the way. You get lots of tourism, you get lots of business, you get lots of investment, you get lots of transport services, you get lots of modernization. It's not a bad thing to be. Being at the hub of the old Silk Roads was a very good thing for Samarkand or Bukhara or the other ancient cities when the Silk Road was at the center of the world activity. So my view is the BRICS might be not just a good grouping because it's large, significant, and so forth, but it might be directly useful for the South Caucasus region, because I could imagine, I'm speaking a little bit loosely, but why not Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia all joining the BRICS? And then because Turkey wants to join the BRICS too. They said, we want to be a member. Then you have a whole region which is together. Its commitment is to connectivity, infrastructure, digital connectivity, and so forth. You become a partner, by the way, of China's very sophisticated high tech, for example, in 5G telecommunications, where China is the low-cost producer of the most advanced digital communications. There could be huge advantages, in other words, for Armenia in this. Very palpable, direct economic benefits as well as security benefits.
I have a question about our good neighbor, Iran. It's very important for us to have stability in that country. What do you think? What's Trump policy towards Iran is going to be?
Well, let's start with what Iran's current policy is. Really, for at least the last 10 years, Iran's policy is we want to come out of the diplomatic cold. We want sanctions against us removed. We want to actually reestablish economic relations, not only with our neighborhood, but with the United States and Europe. And Europe said, that's a good idea. And Obama said, that's a good idea. And they negotiated the JCPOA, the Joint Common Program, in which sanctions would be ended and in which Iran would stop its nuclear program. And then, of course, Trump came in and ripped the whole thing up. Not a very good move, and an example of how Trump can be a destabilizing force. Now, what has changed since then? Iran has continued on the diplomatic path. By far, the most significant further advance of Iran is that it is reconciled with Saudi Arabia. Very interesting, by the way, because it was thought in the United States that Saudi Arabia and Iran were mortal enemies, and the U.S. as an empire was always using the old Roman maxim, divide et impera, divide and conquer. And so the United States loved the fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That may sound cynical, but the U.S. loves fights. because it's an empire. It wants to see neighbors fight with each other. It wants to see, because it's good for the military-industrial complex, and it's good for the United States to come and say, we're your friend, we'll defend you against the enemy. Just let us put a military base there. This is the U.S. game. So the U.S. thought, okay, we can always keep pressure on. We'll side with the Saudis against the evil Iranians. Iran is not evil. Iran wanted normal relations. In comes China, a much more sophisticated foreign policy, by the way. I have to make a comparison. China is 10 times older, and often I think 10 times wiser than the United States of America. So China came in, it didn't see irreconcilable differences between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It sat down with both of them and said, why don't you make peace? What do we have? Just last week, the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, called Iran our sisterly neighbor in the warmest possible language and said, we defend Iran against threats coming from the United States. So all of this shows Iran has wanted diplomacy. I sat down, I was very fortunate and honored to have a session together with President Pezeshkian, the new president of Iran, when he came to the UN in September. What did I find? The session was all about peace. He speaks in an extremely peaceful manner. It's not a charade. He is a heart surgeon. He said, as a surgeon, my first motive is save the life of the patient. I don't ask, is that patient an enemy or is it a friend? It's my patient. It is my moral responsibility to save the life. And he says, that is my view of Iran and foreign policy as well. I want wars to stop. What does the U.S. do? Yak, 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 Iran, evil, evil, evil. Well, that's just pure propaganda. It's tiring, by the way, to hear just U.S. propaganda all the time. But in any event, Iran wants diplomacy. And China wants to help Iran and Saudi Arabia be good friends. So can you have good relations with Iran? Of course. If you do so, what will the U.S. say? Oh, don't do that, evil country, and so forth. Pure propaganda. They're your neighbor. Make good relations with them.
Professor Sachs, you mentioned that Putin and Trump might try to end this war, and I certainly hope that they do. It was a horrific casualty numbers that we're hearing. And the U.S. might promise that NATO would not expand. Well, 2 days ago you were quoting somebody else who was saying that NATO would not expand. 30 years ago, perhaps?
Yes.
I think it was Hans Dietrich Genscher
yes.
and James Baker, right? The famous thing, we will not expand 1 inch to the east. And now some people are saying this never happened. So would Putin be wise to believe just a promise, another promise, or do you think there will be some guarantees required or some kind of an agreement signed, formal agreement, guaranteeing the neutrality of Ukraine? But, we had neutral Sweden, we had neutral Finland. They're not neutral anymore. And Austria, from what I understand, there is some sentiment, some people, or maybe it's being stirred up, not to be neutral anymore. So what guarantees would there be?
Well, it's very important to understand that World War II never ended with a treaty. And I think the United States was to blame. The reason it never ended with a treaty is that the Soviet Union said Germany killed 27 million of our people. We want Germany to be disarmed and neutral. And of course, Germany itself was divided into occupation zones as of the end of the war in 1945. The U.S. immediately came to the view in the summer of 1945, well, the next war will be with the Soviet Union. So rather than making a peace agreement to end World War II, the U.S. and the British and the French occupation zones merged, formed the Federal Republic of Germany, and rearmed Germany. And by the way, fact is, put a lot of former Nazis back in charge of leading armaments industries. And a few years later, Germany joined NATO. And this was, of course, for the Soviet Union, both an affront and a threat. And NATO was never viewed as a defensive force. What the Soviet Union viewed NATO as was the next front in a continuing Western war against the Soviet Union. There were periods of détente, for example, with Nixon, interestingly. There were periods of tension, but there was never an end to World War II on the basis of a treaty. When Mikhail Gorbachev said, I want to end the Cold War, and be sure he ended the Cold War, and he ended it peacefully, and this needs to be remembered. It wasn't an American victory. Mikhail Gorbachev said, I want the walls to come down. Of course, Reagan peacefully wanted to do that together with Gorbachev, but this was Gorbachev's initiative. I watched a lot of it firsthand, close up in Central and Eastern Europe as an economic advisor at the heads of governments that were involved in this. There arose immediately the question of German reunification. And in that context, there needed to be an agreement between the West and the Soviet Union for the legal end of the occupation of Germany. So German reunification was a legal event that was essentially the end of World War II. You needed the Soviet assent. And what did the United States and Germany say to the Soviet Union to get that assent? It was not ambiguous. It was not unclear. They said, without any equivocation, we will have German reunification and NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And those are the words used by U.S. Secretary of State James Baker III directly to Mikhail Gorbachev on February 9th, 1990. And Hans-Dietrich Genscher is on a tape. You can listen. He says, when we say it won't move, we don't just mean within Germany. We mean anywhere to the east. It's so clear. Of course, America cheats. Please understand this. America is a big power. It cheats. It tries to do what it can do. It uses media, propaganda to get away with cheating. That's what big powers do, have no question. So a few years later, the United States, oh, we never promised that. You just read it in the documentation. You can find it online in something called the National Security Archive of George Washington University. It's all absolutely available online to read these documents, to watch these tapes. So the U.S. in 1994, under Bill Clinton, cheated. They adopted a plan. NATO will expand eastward. And by the way, not just eastward, maybe 100 kilometers or 300 kilometers, but keep going east, all the way to Ukraine, all the way to Georgia, remember. And they wanted to even go beyond. I'm sure that some crazy person in the United States said, why not Kazakhstan? Why not Uzbekistan?
Why not Armenia?
Why not Armenia? Of course. Their idea in 1990, I know it, was we won. Especially, by the way, in December 1991, the Soviet Union ended. And the American strategists, if you can call them that, it's a kind of euphemism because they hardly are good at strategy. But the American strategists said, we're alone. We're the most powerful country in the history of the world. We're more powerful than the Roman Empire. We're the world's sole superpower. We can do whatever we want. So that was the mindset. And cheating goes along with that mindset, the arrogance of power. So, to make a long story short, yes, the United States started to expand. Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of these strategists, explained in 1997 in his book, The Grand Chessboard, very clearly in a chapter, very meticulously laid out why Russia would be unable to resist. Because he asked the question, what if the U.S. pushes NATO? What if Europe keeps expanding eastward, crowds Russia, surrounds Russia? What can Russia do? And Brzezinski asked the question, well, could it resist, or will it have to give in? And he reaches the conclusion, Russia will have no choice. He reaches the conclusion, for example, Russia will never form an alliance with China. He reaches the conclusion, Russia will never form an alliance with Iran. You know, okay, theorists, this is playing games. He compared the world to a chessboard. By the way, the world is not a chessboard. It's not a poker game. It's real lives of 8 billion people. American strategists are trained in game theory, which by itself, in its name, gives everything away. They treat the world as a game. Bluff, raise, call, as if it's a poker game. And you know what? They use other people's lives to do it. They raise the stakes with Putin. We raise you. But whose lives were they betting on the table? The Ukrainian lives. Oh, not a good show.
Coming back to economy, how important is deficit financing for U.S. economic growth? And how important is military spending for justifying the deficit spending?
Yeah. The U.S. budget deficit, if any other country had it, would be first order alarm bells, because the U.S. budget deficit is 7% of GDP, one of the highest deficits in the world relative to the size of the economy. Now, the U.S. is a rich country. It's about $30 trillion in market prices. That's a lot, but the deficit of 7% means more than a $2 trillion deficit. That's a lot of borrowing also. So not only has the U.S. been borrowing a lot, it has been borrowing a lot for so long that the debt is now more than 100% of the gross domestic product. And when our experts extrapolate, well, what will it be 30 years from now, they, on current policy, they come to the conclusion it would be 166% of GDP. In other words, we are unsustainable. If we were Armenia, we'd be a basket case in the hands of the IMF. So this is the situation. This will come home to roost. It's already coming home to roost in that U.S. interest rates are rising because it's harder and harder for the U.S. to borrow. One of the reasons it's harder and harder for the U.S. to borrow is the rest of the world trusts the U.S. a lot less than it used to. One of the reasons it trusts the world, the world trusts the U.S. a lot less than it used to is the U.S. keeps stealing other countries' money. It said to Afghanistan, well, your foreign exchange reserves, we're going to keep them because we don't like the Taliban. It says to Iran, well, you're terrorists. We're going to keep your foreign exchange reserves. North Korea, we're going to keep your foreign exchange reserves. Venezuela, we don't even respect your president. We're going to keep your foreign exchange reserves. And of course, the big prize was $300 billion of Russian foreign exchange reserves. One of the main aims of the BRICS countries is we don't want to keep our money in US dollars anymore. They keep taking it. And by the way, I keep saying to my friends who are senior treasury officials and so on, you know, if you want others to use the US dollar, which makes it easy for us to borrow, stop taking their money. How are you going to get them to lend you money if you keep taking it? They don't listen to me, either about wars or about taking other countries' foreign exchange currency. So my view is that this deficit is a big deal. Now, here's another problem. Who elected Trump? Billionaires. Who was opposing Trump with Harris? Billionaires. When you look at our politics, we, the people, we're like a spectator sport. Who are the billionaires? Well, it's that list on this side, it's that list on this side. We sit back. Who's going to win? I don't know, but it's going to be the billionaires. So what do the billionaires backing Trump want? Tax cuts. What did the billionaires backing Harris want? Tax cuts. What is the election going to produce? Tax cuts. Big surprise. Is it a drama? Of course it's not a drama. Our Congress is corrupt. Our political system is corrupt. It's run by the big boys. It's not run by the little people. So we're going to have more tax cuts. So here comes Trump, elected by a disgruntled voting population. the working class. This is his core. And he's telling the working class, you've been cheated. I'm going to support you. And what's he going to do? He's going to give tax cuts to the richest people in the world. 10 people now, 10 people have a net worth of $2 trillion. I'm sorry, we can't even imagine what this means. The days after Trump was elected, their net worth increased $100 billion in days, because people who have money know, oh, this is a bonanza for the billionaires. By the way, if Harris had won, it probably would have gone up the same way, because it's billionaires on both sides. So this deficit is going to rise. It's not going to fall. Now, Trump has a very particular, clever electoral strategy. He says to the voters, the billionaires are your friend. That's not the problem. Your enemy is the immigrant, and your enemy is China. And I'm going to go after your enemies, not your friends, the billionaires. So what Trump says is, I'm going to raise tariffs on the Chinese, I'm going to kick out the immigrants, and you're going to live the American dream. And it's not going to happen. And so, sure enough, within the next years, the Trump administration will be a failure of widening income inequalities, big unhappiness, larger budget deficits, frictions with China, a lot of lawsuits in the United States of people trying to stay within the U.S. that are threatened with deportation. It's not going to be a happy period. And this, unfortunately, comes from the fact that when you have two parties, billionaires backing this one and billionaires backing this one, someone gets left out, and that's the people.
To that point, as a U.S. citizen, someone who values American
as I am a
democracy,
U.S. citizen,
as you, of course,
yes.
Much more American than I, and someone who cares about all of this. So here we are, arguing what will the policy be like under Democrats, under Republicans. But some of my friends from the U.S. are saying, Arthur, it's one party, it's a uniparty,
yes.
And just like you said, they're all sponsored by, a certain very wealthy social class.
Yeah.
So in the end, does it really matter if there is this thing called foreign policy elite or deep state or whatever you call it, people who can influence foreign policy no matter who is elected? What I think would be helpful at some point in the future is to look at the whole practice of lobbyism.
Yes.
Because to me, it resembles a little bit like legalized corruption.
Yes.
When money is being poured into the political system to influence political decisions. It's not a very good thing for American democracy.
American democracy is a democracy on the surface. This is a plutocracy by any definition. It's a government run by big interests. It's good to remember that when the Roman Republic ended and the Roman Empire began, usually dated to 27 BC, when Octavius became Augustus, but actually gradually changed from republic to empire decades before that, including with Julius Caesar and Pompey and Mark Antony and the rest. The formal structure of democracy actually remained, or not democracy, but of republicanism. The Senate remained. The Senate remained for centuries afterwards. Of course, it was just people in togas being given perks, but they didn't have any power after the emperors came to rule. But in a way, the U.S. is a bit like that, which is that we have the semblance of democracy, but it's run actually on two pillars. One is the deep state, which is a secretive power structure of the Pentagon, the CIA, the arms contractors, the security institutions, or insecurity institutions as I call them, war and so on. And the other is the big money. And the big money is the billionaires as a class, and the lobbying groups in particular. Wall Street does this, big health insurers have this part, and so on, a number of distinct economic interests. it's not very functional. The American people know they are powerless. They don't like the way the country's going. They vote out the incumbents. Trump's vote, after all, wasn't even a vote for Trump. It was a vote against the status quo. He didn't win more votes than in 2020, but Harris got a lot less votes than Biden had received in 2020 because the Biden administration didn't deliver for anybody. It just made more war, more insecurity, more inflation, more deficits, more debt, and the public knew it. So it's an unhappy situation. I would not say the people are in control. I would not say this is government of the people, by the people, and for the people that Abraham Lincoln talked about. I would say this is a government of the rich, by the rich, for the rich. And unfortunately, it doesn't deliver for most Americans right now. And the idea that, well, it will deliver because we'll go after the foreigners, which is Trump's signature card. America first, we'll attack China, we'll attack the migrants, and so on. Unfortunately, he doesn't really get to the core of what is the problem with the U.S. economy.
You work with young people as a professor, and what is your message to them? What should they do in this new world? Where should they go? What should they think about?
It is the craziest thing. We have more ability to solve problems. We have more technology. We have more wonders. Elon Musk, who I regard as a genius inventor and entrepreneur, even though he's de facto our prime minister now, which is a very different role. But we could solve so many problems if we were really wanting to do so. We could end these wars quickly. We could actually transform our energy system so we stop ruining the climate. We could have precision agriculture so we're not chopping down the rainforests of the world. In other words, we could really make a good life for people on the planet with all this wonderful technology. It's not even so hard to do. It's hard to get the understanding of this when there's so much greed and power games around. My view is, let's make shared prosperity. The American view for the last 30 years is, let's be number one. My argument is, who cares about being number one? Let's be safe, secure, and prosperous, not number one. And if China's there, great. And if China's successful, even better. That's good for us. That's not against us. So, to my mind, we're trapped in zero-sum thinking, that either we're dominant or we're going to be dominated. This is ridiculous. I want young people to think about peace and about better lives and about solutions, whether it's in the neighborhood of the South Caucasus or whether it's world challenges like global climate change or other big global challenges. We could have a wonderful period ahead if we would just behave ourselves, talk with each other, put down the weapons, actually focus on the problem solving. So I say to young people, don't despair, for sure. Don't lose hope. Yes, shake your head at these 70 or 80 or 90-year-old politicians. You know, they really should retire because the world is changing a lot. The new technologies should be empowering us, but let's not aim for war or the business of hating your neighbor. Let's try to figure out how to live together in peace and prosperity.
Speaking of despair, you just came back from the UN conference in Baku on climate change. I'm in no way an expert on this issue, and certainly you know much more. Apparently, we're close to a point of irreversibility. I've seen some reports that we have 11 years to turn this around, otherwise it becomes irreversible because of the feedback effect. Methane being released into the atmosphere and the greenhouse effect getting even worse. And now the average temperature has risen by 1.5 degrees, right. I'm told. So how close are we to the point where it'll be too late to turn back? And why are we busy killing each other where we should be thinking about our whole human race disappearing if this continues?
Look, we're already in some practically irreversible processes where we're going to lose parts of the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland maybe not in 10 years, maybe in 50 years, maybe in 100 years, but that's going to raise sea levels, and if you happen to be in a low-lying place, that's going to be irreversible. So it's already happening. The name of the game is to stop that as fast as possible from going on, because the more we go on, the more dangerous and destructive these irreversibilities will be. So it's not that there's a safe zone, and if we just get it right, we stay safe. We're already experiencing massive disasters, droughts, floods, extreme storms, more forest fires. More is sure to come. But the more we delay, the worse it will be. And when you go to COP29, there were about 50,000 people supposedly at the meeting. What you find is that worldwide, there is, in every part of the world, business and government that knows that this is happening and that wants to do something. So it's not hopeless. But you also find the recalcitrant side. Generally, the rule is if you have oil and gas and coal, you're delaying the transformation. It's not very sociable. It's not very respectful of your own children or of your grandchildren or of the rest of the world. But countries like the United States, Russia, Canada, Australia, they have a lot of oil and gas, the Gulf countries, and their attitude is, we're going to keep producing. That's our wealth. That's our income. And we haven't found an honest way to negotiate around the table, a true way to negotiate that says, okay, we see your interests, we see our interests, but the fact of the matter is destroying the climate doesn't suit any of us. So how do we find a way that can actually make it work for everybody, including for the future, including for your children, your grandchildren, my grandchildren? It's strange. I've been at this business for 44 years. Governments are not very clever in general. Politicians are not very well trained in general. And diplomacy is harder than it looks. The basic idea that we have in a classroom, which we do have, in a good classroom, you sit around the table and you discuss with the students, you argue, you debate, you reach a common understanding. That process actually doesn't work in the international scene like it should. It still puzzles me why it doesn't, because rather than 50,000 people at a meeting, I'd rather have the 20 emitters around the table for 1 week and say, please, ladies and gentlemen, you have a week. We're going to go through all the data. We're going to go through all the numbers. We have experts sitting on the outside. We have people that are fact-based, not running for office, sitting around the outside. We can always, we'll ring a bell. That's a lie. That you don't understand. That's what you could do. And you discuss, and you have a week. Or maybe, like they do at the Vatican, we lock the door until you reach an agreement, which is a process I really like, the conclave, as the Romans call it. With the key, lock the door, and the cardinals have to come up with a solution. That's what I would like of the 20 emitting countries. We don't need thousands and tens of thousands of people. They won't do it. We need around 20 around the table, but seriously discussing.
I'll go to China, because in this upcoming administration we'll have a lot of tough guys towards China. What do you think what's going to happen with US-China relations? Only economic wars, or maybe something even hotter?
First, I have to say, I'm a Sinophile. I like China. And to say that, Chinese civilization for me is one of the great civilizations of history. China unified in 221 BC. So this is 2,250 years ago. This is a great civilization. China, by the way, had long centuries never attacked its neighbors because they believed in a kind of Confucian harmony among the East Asian countries. So I've studied this at length because scholars have written about this at length. that China, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan had hundreds of years of peace together. Wow, Europe never pulled that off. This region, I would say, never pulled that off. Everyone's always fighting. But China had a way with this idea of harmony and Confucian ideal that it really did pull it off peacefully. Many American scholars don't even believe it because they can't imagine it. American scholars are raised in the idea that war is inevitable, that conflict is inevitable, that powers always clash. China says, no, no, we believe in peaceful coexistence. Americans say, no, that's impossible. I see the skepticism all over the place. But from 1368, which was the beginning of the Ming dynasty, the end of the Mongol dynasty, the beginning of the Ming dynasty, to 1839, which was when Britain invaded China in what's called the First Opium War. For that period of nearly 600 years, there was basically peace in East Asia until Europe started to bother them and destabilize the situation. So I like China, and I believe that China's done a great job in the last 40 years. And not only has it done a great job, it's done such a great job that America hates China. Now, this sounds ridiculous. Why would America hate China? Because China became so successful, it's a rival to the United States. If there's one thing America hates, it's a rival. Because America's self-image is, we're number one. We run the world. We're the sole superpower. I say that's ridiculous with all respect, as an American. We are 4.1% of the world population. 4.1%. 335 million Americans. China's 1.4 billion people. We're going to run China. We're going to dominate China. We're going to defeat China. Have a brain, I try to tell my American friends. But they want America first because that's what they learned at the end of the Cold War, that we're the world's sole superpower. I believe we have nothing to fear from China. China's going to invade the United States? I don't think so. China's going to upset American democracy? I don't think so. Biden said the world is divided between democracies and autocracies. First, anyone who defines the world as a division is on the wrong track because we're all in this together. This is the first point. But second, even if China's an autocracy, which I think is a little bit of a silly one word to describe China's statecraft, but anyway, even if it were, it's no threat to the United States. And by the way, as I said, it would be nice if we were a real democracy. That's another matter. But the point is, China's not a threat to the American political system. China's not a threat to our security. China maybe it's a threat to themselves. I don't think so. I think they're doing a very good job. China's not even a threat to its neighbors, by the way. Because, and I say even, because America says, well, they're militarizing the South China Sea. They're putting military installations on coral reefs and atolls in the South China Sea. But why? Why? Because the United States, in its published doctrine, says we have choke points on China's sea lanes. China trades for its energy and for its food. So China depends for its fundamental security on its sea lanes in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean. And the United States, in its naive way, says, yes, but we can choke China trade in the Straits of Malacca. We can choke China trade by holding them behind the first island chain, and many naive ideas. But China is reacting to the U.S. It's not being aggressive and militaristic. It's saying to the U.S., you're surrounding us? Well, we're going to have to defend ourselves. Again, if there are grown-ups, but if they would act like grown-ups and they would discuss with each other rather than point the finger or accuse each other in political campaigns, but really talk to each other, there'd be no conflict between the U.S. and China. Now, one interesting puzzle that I have, the question is, could the U.S. ever get out of its deep state hegemonic mentality? And I have a hope. It's a strange one, but my hope is yes. And the reason is that it's been such a colossal failure that maybe the powerful interests in the United States have come to realize that that idea of 1991, the unipolar world, didn't work out. Now, you come back to my thought that we're really run by billionaires. Think of Elon Musk. Where's his gigafactory? In Shanghai. Does he really want a war with China? I don't think so. Think of the other big billionaire backers of Donald Trump. They're investing heavily in China. Do they really want a war with China? So maybe they're the ones that are going to say to the deep state, why don't you get a different approach? One that protects our money, one that protects our interests, rather than World War III. It's not impossible.
Just a short comment, perhaps. I very much share and I welcome your faith, the faith that you place in China. I take it that some of your close friends and some very distinguished professors disagree in a way.
Yeah.
We know Professor Mearsheimer thinks a little bit differently, being a realist. While, if I may say so, the argument you presented is more of a classic liberal argument. Trade, peace, everybody wins, everybody benefits. Being where we are today, on the brink of a possible nuclear conflict, which some people are saying, when you speak about it, it's Putin's argument, it's Putin's bluff, we're going to call this bluff, which is incredibly dangerous in my opinion. What would it take for the world leaders to reject this model of domination and go back to the model of equilibrium and balance and mutual respect and restraint? Because you were talking about children, thinking about our children's future. I mean, we are now at a point where we have to be very careful, or we will not be able to hold our children anymore, because you can't hold something that's not there.
Yep.
I mean, what would it take?
I had a recent discussion with John Mearsheimer about these issues, and first of all, he's a very good friend, and he's a wonderful person and a wonderful scholar. And we agree on 2 out of the 3 hotspot zones. We agree on Ukraine, that this war was provoked by the U.S. and has to end. We agree on the Middle East, that this war was provoked by the Israel lobby and it needs to end. We disagree on China. By the way, not because he says China's evil, just because he says that great powers get into conflict with each other. Now, that's called realism in academia,
yes.
But there are different variants of realism. And one kind of realism says that it is realistic for great powers to be able to find a peaceful accommodation of each other, that's realistic. And there's another kind of realism that is part of our nuclear age. And that realism says that nuclear weapons changed what realism is, because old realism was, well, you had some wars, but that was okay, not the best. It was a reality. But the new realism is we can't afford a war between nuclear powers, because that would end humanity, not to mention the 2 competing powers, so that there can't be a winner in a nuclear scenario. And I take both the idea that realism includes mutual accommodation and the idea that the nuclear age is different from all past history. We have to be all the more careful. If Russia says, don't use your ATACMS to hit us deep in our territory, that will be a war directly between the US, because you will have programmed and armed and tracked the missiles, and us, and we are 2 nuclear superpowers. My kind of realism says that's realistic. Take that seriously. Red lines are not to be tested, or stupid statements by American leaders that say, oh, don't fall for the bluff. I regard such statements as profoundly immature, profoundly incorrect, profoundly reckless, and profoundly unrealistic. Those are people trained in some classroom in game theory. They are not living real life, and they're not taking my life, but much more importantly, my children and my grandchildren's life seriously. They're playing a game. And they don't even know, well, they use the language of games, bluffs, signals, credibility, deterrence through escalation. These are game theory concepts in the nuclear age that are going to get us all killed 1 hour. By the way, it is going to be 1 hour.
20 minutes.
A nuclear war will end the world in about 2 hours, as a recent incredibly searing book by Annie Jacobson called Nuclear War, A Scenario, has laid out second by second. And we've got to do everything to prevent this. So when China says, don't meddle in our affairs with Taiwan, yes, good idea. When Russia says, don't put NATO right up against our borders, very good idea. When the United States says, don't put your military in the Caribbean or in Mexico, very good idea. The big powers should stay a little bit out of the way. It used to be the idea that buffer states or neutral states was a stabilizing approach for the world. At the end of World War II, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, as you mentioned, formed a kind of buffer line that separated the Soviet sphere and the American sphere in Western Europe. It worked. It really worked. The idea that now it's so crucial for Sweden and Finland to join NATO, for Ukraine to join NATO, this is completely contrary to that idea. This is the idea that the United States has to press its nose right up against Russia. 2 nuclear powers, each with 6,000 nuclear warheads, as if this is a way that normal, rational people should behave. So my form of realism is, let's survive. That's realism for me.
Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you very much for watching this interview with distinguished Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I'm Suren Sargsyan at the studios, Armenian Center for American Studies Director, and my colleague Artur Khachikian, a professor from Stanford University, and follow us on 168.am on YouTube. Thank you and goodbye.